Hello and welcome to this Fane online event, a live stream with Nels Abbey. It's wonderful to have those of you who are joining us here live this afternoon, and also welcome to all viewers watching on demand in the 48-hour period after this live event. I'm Charmaine Lovegrove, I'm the publisher of Inclusive Imprint Dialogue Books, and I'm delighted to be talking to Nels and celebrating and amplifying his debut work. Welcome, Nels Abbey.
Charmaine, it is an absolute delight to be with you. Thank you very, very much.
I'm going to introduce you first, and then we're going to get into the conversation. I'm really, really excited. So, Nels Abbey is a British-Nigerian satirist, writer, and media executive. He was previously a banker, and Nels is also a founding organizer of the Black Writers Guild. Think Like a White Man is published by Canongate and is out now in paperback from all good retailers. Nels, hi. It's just really great for us to be having this conversation. I love this book so much. So first of all, I want to thank you for writing about race in such a profound and satirical manner. I've never come across this style before, and your comic timing is impeccable. You really hit all the beats.
Well, thank you.
Do you have a background in comedy? I've always wanted to ask you that.
I don't, as it would happen. I don't have a background in comedy. I think I'm just somebody who's able to. I come from a situation. I think my life situations is placed me in a position where I've always found refuge in humor. So I've always been able to use humor as a means of overcoming trauma, and I think that's pretty much where it developed itself. So, and also too, as a man who. Working class man, which means that you're a man without much money or so, and I'm not the best looking brother in the world. So in order to get girls, I had to at least be funny. So so as a result of that, I think it developed over time. So here we are.
So the professor of modern white people studies, Dr. Boulé Whytelaw III, is an incredible character. Tell us how he came to you, and also, is he based upon anyone that we should know about, or we do already know about?
I must be absolute. It's a Boulé Whytelaw, professor of white people studies, the world's leading whiteologist, is a brilliant man. He contacted me in 2016, bugged and bothered me, swore to me that his messages has to go out there into the world, and I am the right vehicle to help him get it out there. Also, which means that I was the mule, I was the donkey to do his hard work, also to do the actual writing, and here we are. But of course. Boulé Whytelaw is, of course, I'll lift the joke for anybody who hasn't read it. Boulé Whytelaw only partially exists. He's a work of fiction that's been used to carry a work of satirical fiction that's used to carry a very, very serious topic. And is he based on anybody? I wouldn't say. I think he's based on a lot of different people, a lot of different situations, but there isn't one particular person who I'd say that he's based on. Certainly nobody who would jump to mind or so. If there's anybody who I think I drew some degree of influence from, it was a character in the Spike Lee movie Bamboozled. It was a character called Pierre Delacroix, who was this Harvard-educated black guy who was just a complete nightmare of a black guy who was a frustrated media executive who wrote a minstrel show in order to get sacked from his job. And but his views on race and everything else were so profound that I thought he inspired Boulé Whytelaw as a character a little bit in terms of tone and comedic timing.
So Think Like a White Man really reads like a sort of get-rich-quick book meets a self-help book. Tell us about how you would describe it, and also kind of what section of the bookshop should we be looking for it in?
So that is probably the best. That's probably been the toughest question of the Think Like a White Man experience. Where does it go in the bookshop? And it was a really tough one because my publisher, the great Canongate Books, they classified it as humor. So I remember the first day in which it came out, as every first-time writer does, you run to the bookshop, and I thought, okay, it's not in the window. It's not on the front tables, and your self-esteem is plummeting bit by bit, and you're wondering where the hell is the book in this shop over here? And they told me, no, it's in the humor section. And the humor section is like on the 5th floor, on the back shelf somewhere else down there. And then when you get there, you then realize that the book is actually right beside Viz's War and Piss, or the best boob jokes of the year, or dad jokes from the 1970s. And you're thinking, this does not belong here. This is a serious book on race or so, but it's just satirical. So where does it belong? And that's the question, because it's essentially a genre of one. I described the genre, Boulé Whytelaw described the genre of as racially spiced satire, racially spiced non-fiction satire, which is literally a genre of one. So where does it belong? Wherever books that sell, wherever good books that sell also in the bookshop are, that's where it belongs. So yeah.
Well, in my opinion, it definitely belongs on the front, in the window, and it's a book that everyone should be reading. It's, Blackness has a really tricky history with satire. How were you able to navigate your character to be on the right side of that discourse?
I think for me, it was easier with Boulé Whytelaw, easier to do so than, say, the subsequent character is going to come out of the next book, because Boulé Whytelaw is, at the core of him, is somebody who loves Black people, who wants Black people to win, and he's grounded very firmly in the Black community. He's comfortably being a Black person, but he's a Black person who thinks and speaks like the most comfortable of white men, which is very, very unique a situation. So when some of the language he uses, some of the actual terms he uses, you'll probably expect to hear them more from a Donald Trump than you would, say, from any Black person whatsoever, and that was on purpose. So I think that it was a lot easier with Boulé Whytelaw, and also too, from my own perspective, in terms of actually as a writer, as a person who's aware of history, and how humor has at times been weaponized viciously. Poor humor has been weaponized viciously against Black people. It's something that I was very, very aware of. So I was very familiar with minstrel shows. I was very familiar with the minstrel shows being the first, say, American, indigenous American art form, and the impact it actually had, and I knew how popular those things became across time, and how much transatlantic popularity actually enjoyed. And so I wanted to be very, very clear that in this humor is going to be something that not even the core reader, but I wanted Black readers to really appreciate very, very vintage, cutting edge Black British humor that I knew that they would recognize, but something that could translate across the world too. But I didn't want it to be something that would make any reader feel lesser than. Certainly not Black readers, not in the slightest bit or so. I wanted Black people readers in particular to feel elevated by this actual book and by the humor within it. But I wanted it to be something that was, again, the humor. I needed it to be something that was not pandering. I wanted it to be very, very crisp Black humor in its truest tradition. And I think, humbly speaking, I think we achieved that to a certain degree.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think the thing from the first page is that it absolutely lifts your spirit, actually, which I think is a really strange thing to kind of think about when thinking about race. I can't see you. Are you still there? Okay. So thinking about audience.
Oh, I'm back. I'm back now. I heard from the first page.
Okay, so from the first page, it absolutely lifts your spirit, because although it's a really dark subject, the way in which you've written it is kind of transcends a lot of humor and satire that I've experienced, and I think we haven't really had that in terms of sort of Black British culture. But I want to ask you a question about that later. But first of all, I want to ask you about audience. And having an audience in mind before you start. Is that something that you did? And how do you feel the book landed with the audience when it first came out in hardback?
It's a very, very good question. So did I have an audience in mind? Oh, I can hear something in the background. Did I have an audience in mind from the beginning of this? I think that when I set out to write a book that chronicled the Black experience in the professional realm, And so as a result of that, I knew that the Black audience was going to be the core of what I was actually writing over here. But I still wanted to write something that had very, very significant crossover appeal and would be of educational, informational, and entertaining interest to a wider audience than the core Black audience. And so that was my original thinking for that. And I think that so with that in mind, I think it was a lot easier to tailor the content, of course, but getting the humor right was also very important too, and being able to sell that humor to publishers too. So how did it land? When it was originally published in hardback, the first thing that I found that was really interesting was that the dedication kind of went viral on WhatsApp, because loads of people kept messaging me saying, "Have you read this book? Look at the dedication of this book." And the dedication is quite punchy, but that was the only part that I was quite nervous about in the entire book. And when that came out and it was going viral, and then people got it, I realized that was the only part that I thought was too much, and I wanted to remove. But my publisher was wise to say that we should keep it in there, and that's where I just thought, okay, it was better that we just I think that from that moment I saw that people got that and appreciated that element of the humor. I then realized, it was going to land very well, and I think it did land well. I think it did quite well.
Yeah, it was definitely a book that lots of people were talking about, and specifically a lot of Black people were very inspired and empowered by. What I really love is how liberating it feels to be able to laugh out loud about a painful subject such as race. Did it feel liberating for you to write it?
Yes, very. It felt very liberating for me to write it. It felt almost like therapy for a long time, and I think that's why it got a bit long, because there were certain times where I was dealing with heavy subjects in my professional life, and I was getting over it by going home and just writing jokes about it in the evening or so. And it was almost so when I handed it over to my publisher for publishing, which means that it's done. You cannot change it anymore. So it's over. This is it. Left in me. It really felt a bit tough. It felt like, hey, I'm giving my baby away, or I'm giving my therapist away, essentially a little bit. And so it really was liberating. And I also think it felt as if it felt like it was fighting back again to a certain degree. It felt like it was a protest, almost a protest. Every single joke of anti-racist protest, in my view. And I think that it certainly was liberating. It really did help me to a large degree. I enjoyed writing it. I cannot lie. I enjoyed writing this one.
Could you elaborate a bit on the idea of an anti-racist protest?
Yeah, so protests the purpose of the protest essentially is to create an awareness of an injustice. Is to express outrage, of course, and to create awareness of an injustice or a wrongdoing or folly or hypocrisy or vice or so. And that is essentially the purpose of humor, of satire, is to use humor to create an awareness or to mock or ridicule vice or hypocrisy or folly or wrongdoing and anything else. So I think there's an overlap between protest and satire altogether. That the job of the satirist is to actually highlight that things are going wrong in society over here. This is not right, and there should be some awareness brought to it also, but it should be shamed. And the best way, if you really want to shame somebody or something into actually changing, there's many ways of doing so, but my way of doing so is actually via humor. But I did feel that as I was writing this, I knew that it would be something that that it wouldn't buy me as many friends as, say, if I wrote something about, I don't know, if I just wrote a very, very different type of book that wasn't as stinging, that didn't go to the heart of things, it was a little bit more subtle, a little bit more careful. So even on the very same subject, it would probably would have been easier for it to attain an immediate widespread audience or get it into newspapers than it was. Because again, it was subversive, it was distrusted. And because it was distrusted, so it was recognized immediately that there's a bit more to this, that it almost was protest. And even if you go back to, say, the history of Black people, particularly Black people in the Western Hemisphere, particularly Black people who were enslaved, humor, and I'm not of that descent, I'm afraid to say, but the humor is always a method of protesting, of expressing disdain for our treatment or so, for our treatments, and how things have actually gone. If you go back to, of course, in the plantations, it's famously done so. So was actually snapping and rapping, amongst other things too. So so I felt that, hey, it was just that. It was something I wanted people who live with the burden of racism every single day to recognize it, almost to punch the air, recognize that, yeah, we're fighting back against racism, one laugh at a time, as a protest.
Yeah, I think that's really, really important to signal, because we also have that with music, we have that with dancing, we have lots of forms of Black expression, and humour is one of them. And, you know, these are things that, you know, my family are from the Caribbean, and my ancestors were enslaved, and these are things that we weren't allowed to do. And so the fact that we then do them so well, hundreds of years later, having to sort of relearn, despite living under white supremacy, I think shows how incredible we are. I think another thing that you said that's really interesting, thinking about when it was published originally as hardback and now that it's published as paperback, you've kind of published into this moment. And obviously that's not planned, because we can't plan these things. We would never plan for Black people to be murdered as George Floyd was. We wouldn't plan for the sheer inequality and racism that we live in to happen. But I do think it's really interesting that the book has come out as paperback now and is much more accessible. And so do you think that with a lot of people having read serious anti-racist books, that they can now come to this?
Charmaine, I didn't quite hear the end bit of the question there.
I said that so many people during lockdown had been reading a lot of serious anti-racist books, such as Renee Edo-Lodge or Layla F. Said, and you know, they really help propel white people into a space of thinking about race. You said earlier that, you know, when the book came out, people weren't really sure exactly how to take it. And do you feel now, because there's been so much conversation in the advent of Black Lives Matter, that that's a wider conversation that the book can land into?
Yes, I do. I think that it's part of that ecosphere that many books have brought up. Renee's book, Layla's book, of course, to a degree. Robin DiAngelo, Emma DeBerry's books. I should probably say the names of these books to help, but to spread the word about them. But Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. Me and White Supremacy, or is it White Supremacy and Me? By Layla Saad. And Emma DeBerry's Don't Touch My Hair. Yeah, I think that it does tap into that space. I think the fear that came out so journalists got in touch with me and were saying to me that I'm trying to write about this book. I love it, but my white editor is scared of it. And I had that response so many times, I couldn't believe it. From major publications, from liberal publications to conservative publications. This is print media. Actually, broadcast media really embraced the book very, very much, and I'm thankful to them for it. Shout out to Channel 4 News and everybody else, BBC and the radio, everybody, everywhere else. So what was funny about it is that with print media, they couldn't really. I don't think they could get over the hurdle of a book that was talking about overthrowing the white man or so. That those type of terms were set. I think it conjured up Louis Vuitton revolution imagery in their minds or so, as opposed to this is satire. I'm just doing what Charlie Brooker, Armando Iannucci, many other great Black British satirists have done. Not Black British, but many other British satirists have done. I just happen to be a Black person doing it, and I happen to be doing it about race, which is a topic which is relevant to me. So the problem with it was that in the beginning it was tough to land it, But right now, it has become, I think it's become a bit easier after George Floyd. Sadly, it took a lynching. It took a 2020 lynching for people to recognize that, hey, race is something that you could be educated about whilst actually finding the humor in it. Because it's when you actually drill it down, when you get rid of the atrocities and everything, and you get rid of everything else, it's actually it's a brutal absurdity that has actually debased the lives of millions upon millions upon millions of people for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. But when you actually really drill it down to or so, it's something is ripe for satire. But just because also too, British media is dominated by, is still largely a white institution and industry. So those of us who do things that deviate away from what is now considered to be the norm might find it a bit harder. But the road less traveled often leads to gold is my philosophy. So I just keep walking.
Thinking about Black Lives Matter and the advent of awareness across the world of the movement and of the treatment of Black people, which is horrific. How do you think today, post-lockdown, as people are going back into the office and there is this awareness, how do you think that Black people experience the white corporate world, which has historically and even currently been really oppressive? And how do you think it will change? Do you think that this time will have changed the ideas around how Black people are treated within a white working capitalist environment?
Very good question. Do I think that, look, there's so many different elements. It's the knife in the back of Black people that has been wedged into the back of people we now know as Black people, who were not Black people 500-600 years ago. So that's not what they were known as. They were just Africans or so. This very concept in which people are described as racialized as Black people is an offspring of something we describe as white supremacy. It was in the commercial interests of white ruling class people who wanted to enslave people and colonize other people, amongst other things, or so, where they categorize people into what we now describe as racists. But that's capital, though, that desire for actual capital, that desire to extract capital out of certain people or so, or to extract effort that can generate capital out of certain people, often generates bad practices, very vicious practices to a large degree. And so those of us in Britain, for example, we are actually on the more comfortable side of it in certain elements. Those of us who are in the professional world, I'm acknowledging that those of us who work in offices and do everything else and have nice jobs, we are probably the most privileged of all Black people. There's Black people who are the wedge of whites, who are pretty much in the bottom of mines right now, digging for coltan in the Congo in order to make large white corporations rich. With that in mind, people going back into the actual workplace or so, which who knows how that's going to happen with the potential second wave, but people going back into the workplace, will things change, or would things have changed post George Floyd? I did get a feel that there was a desire for change, that it took a lynching, but people did seem to want to do things differently. That there did seem to be a desire to do things differently, to change things, to stop being so racist and everything else, or try and understand racism within the corporate structure. I work with some organizations to try and achieve this, which is a very good thing. And I'm grateful to them that they want to actually do so. And I'm grateful to them that they're paying me to help them do so too at the same time. Do I think things would change in the long term? The reality is that everybody, it's like going on a diet or so. It takes discipline or a very good personal trainer or so to keep you on that straight and narrow, to maintain fitness. And I feel that these organizations or the world of work will go back to its old self, which is not hiring Black people, paying Black people less when you hire them, employing them at levels that is junior to their skills and expertise when you hire them, and so on and so forth. I suspect they will go back to the norm if and also to bullying us, sacking us when things go wrong, or sacking us when things go wrong, or blaming us for stuff we had nothing to do with, all the classic racism elements or so. But I feel that things now, right now, what we have is essentially a critical mass for change, and that's a good thing, because that's, once you have a critical mass, that's the only period in which you can really make change in human history. Now, will that change be substantive in the long term? I do not know. What I do know is this is up to us, Black people, to form organizations and take certain methods and actions to make sure that, to hold organizations' feet to the fire, to make sure that enough change is made that we can continue to make progress in the long term. So my answer to your question is, do I think things will change? Probably in the short term. In the long term, I think things will go back to the normal. But in this period of opportunity or so, of critical mass on racism, of anti-racism, we have to actually make sure we have the infrastructure and get the concessions needed to achieve and establish and attain the change we want.
Yes, and obviously, as both founding organisers of the Black Writers Guild, then we totally believe in that for the publishing industry, and it's really important that the that the change that we seek to make is systemic and long-lasting, and has impact not just for writers but for professionals within the publishing industry, which is 99.2% white and 87.4% female. This brings me on to thinking about privilege in its term, and race, class, and opportunities, which you highlight explicitly in Think Like a White Man. It's so interesting to kind of think about privilege through satire when using your voice like that as a Black man. I think it's super smart, because you're always questioning where the privilege lies when you have a protagonist who is also, to a point, complicit. And so, yeah, do you want to talk a little bit about privilege and how you navigated that in the book?
I think that, yeah, to a certain degree. So you asked me about being privileged as a Black male vis-a-vis a Black woman, also as a vis-a-vis a straight Black male to LGBT and women, or Boulé Whytelaw is, to a certain degree, he presents as middle class, although he's largely working class he's largely working class fronting to be a middle class person, in my view. But how do you want me to explain this? How would you wish for me to break it down? Because privilege is so vast.
Well, I think that there's
I can compare it.
Exactly. I think there's an intersectionalism in the book which kind of looks upon those different threads. I think it's about recognizing the attainment or trying to attain that privilege, and how one, regardless of where that privilege lies, whether it's the lightness of your skin, if you're a light-skinned Black person, or if you are indeed a white person, or if you're a man or a woman. It's about that sort of trying to attain that privilege that you weren't born with in order to live as equal or to work as equal within the workplace. And I just found that sort of intersection of the narrative extremely fascinating and deeply compelling. Yeah,
I think that, so if you take, for example, Black people go into the workplace, and you go into, take for what you just said about publishing, 99 point something percent white, 88 point something percent female, which it's nice to see sisters winning. When I say sisters, I mean women across the board in this regard, as opposed to my Black sisters across the board or so. But yeah, but what we're looking at here is an industry such as publishing, or say where I worked in the past, the two industries where I've worked my way up, in banking and in media. In those two industries, I'll use banking as an example to make it a lot easier. Banking, conservative industry, very, very vast, conservative, professional industry, probably at the cutting edge of professionalism in our society, which means that it's hard to overdress to go to work when you're a banker. You can be very, 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 you're expected to look very, very smart. You're expected to conduct yourself in a very, very smart way. You're expected to conduct yourself as a professional. Now, professionalism is predicated upon upper middle class whiteness. So it's the cultural practices, norms, and tastes, and speech patterns and codes of upper middle class white people that's cascaded into the business world, and we now today describe it as professionalism. Now, if you're a black person or a black working class person going into these worlds, also, if say you're a black working class woman going into a upper white middle class dominated industry such as banking, it is extremely difficult for you to navigate it. What you're still trying to do, you have to navigate it nonetheless. But it boils down to that question of how do you find your way up from where you are, from a position of absolute underprivilege, where you are almost very lucky to even be there, and you're competing with extremely privileged people who are swimming within their own waters or so, within their own waters with the tide or so, pushing them along. How do you navigate and compete your way to the very top against those people? How do you find a way to actually recognize their privilege, recognize your underprivilege, and try and actually make your way to the top? What we didn't think like a white man was literally try and examine the privileges associated with being a white male or so, and the certain things that you can do. The certain things you can do and get away with or so, and try and find ways in which black underprivileged, whether you're working or middle class black people or so, to navigate your way through those waters, which can be vicious to you, right to the way to the very top. Which means that you're going to have to be quite dark and quite Machiavellian and quite at times quite horrible also too, and do some things that you probably won't be too proud of. You probably won't want to tell your grandchildren about when the time is right. But you had to do it. You just had to do it or so. So if you take, for example, I am speaking to you today, Charmaine, I'm being my authentic self because I'm talking to you, and that's that. Normally, I'll have a pair of glasses on or so, which are rimless glasses or so, which actually have no basis whatsoever. I'm just wearing them very purely because I want to soften my image as a black man and look a little bit more calmer and professional or so. If I'm going for, say, there's once upon a time or so when I was still a single man, if I was going for a job interview or something else like that, I'd put on a wedding ring because I knew that, hey, that corporations preferred actually employing married middle class or married white middle class men. Now, I couldn't be a white man, but I could at least be married or so, present myself as if I was married or something else like that. So I'd wear a fake wedding ring or something else like that just to create the impression. Those were the funny and light-hearted things, but it gets a lot darker. It got so much darker in terms of the things, in terms of like taking certain political positions when you're in the office or so, which was very, very tough for me to do because I like to think of myself as a fairly stand-up person. So, and then also too, identifying any way in which you could ingratiate yourself and accrue some degree of privilege for yourself was just the things that we touched on within the book, satirically, of course, but there was an element of truth to each of them altogether, I feel.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I've been thinking that, there's so much performative action that comes from being in the office, regardless of race, class, gender, sexuality. It's just, it's actually quite prohibitive to kind of just getting on with the job. And it's been really interesting. I think it's going to be really interesting to see how people of color and people from minority groups have been able to kind of make headway within their career, having not to perform performative actions by being present. Because I just think it's really, it's exhausting. And at the beginning of the book, when you just, even from the first day that Boulé Whytelaw goes to work, and they all think he's the security guard, it's just because he's standing waiting, or just the amount of horrific experiences that I've heard in different organizations over the years, in my industry and of publishing and in other industries, then I do wonder whether or not this new way of working can liberate that, and I definitely can see the opportunities that come with being able to work from home. So the tips to assimilate is really powerful and provocative. Tell us more about that for those who haven't read the book yet, and why was it really important to add it to the book?
I think that, so let's take for example, so what the story you just gave there right now about Boulé Whytelaw standing at the reception waiting for his new boss to come pick him up as a fresh-faced 20-something year old going for his first job ever, the first person in his family to get a professional job, was real life. That was based upon me. That was my first job. It was for a large professional services firm. Everybody mistook me for a security guard, and I mean much of the company just came in and showed me their ID cards. And then you have that element also, is when you get, so but on that very day, they then took me upstairs to my department, 10th floor, beautiful building in London. And when we got there, I looked around and it was literally it was so unbelievably white. And then you are there, a black person, and think to yourself, how do I now find a way to establish myself in the midst of this organization over here? And make myself be seen as somebody who belongs here, not somebody who's potentially here just to actually make things look good or so, when the Equalities and Human Rights Commission starts knocking on their door. And that's when you have to do what Boulé Whytelaw describes as as assimilating in order to accumulate. So the old saying goes for black people, the old saying goes that you have to speculate to accumulate, but if you're a black person, you have to assimilate and speculate to accumulate. And and I think that the maneuvers that the book comes up with are absolutely ridiculous, and they're based upon ridiculous things that happen sometimes. If I take, for example, there's one time I was out for lunch at work, my first job ever. I was about 20, very, very early 20s. And then this is when the first R. Kelly trial was happening. And in the black community, the R. Kelly trial was the talk of the community. That's what we were all talking about at the time. So when we're out lunch or so with all these posh people, I stupidly start talking about the R. Kelly trial or so. And then everybody just turns full silent, and you just feel the lead dropping or so. And then it just felt like I knew that I said the wrong thing right there and then. That is not the place to talk about the R. Kelly trial or anything else or so. And then I then started to learn everything that I was into also was completely miles away from what these guys were into. Sometimes they got into what I was into at a later date. For example, I used to go to work to tell everybody about, there's this TV program called The Wire. It's this American show that I really love watching or so. And there was some slimy guy who figured out that I was just downloading it for online. He just said to me, so how do you watch this American show? So I said, well, this thing called BitTorrent, and you download that, and it happens this, that, something else, so you can just download it to your computer. And he said, is that legal? And then I got called into the office about illegal downloads and everything else or so. And it was so unbelievably embarrassing. Then about 3-4 years later on, The Wire then exploded and became this really, really big program that they were all into. And I was just watching things to myself that, well, I was into the show beforehand, and you guys damn near chastised me for it. Fair enough for downloading it, but that was pretty much it. So again, so in terms of the assimilate to accumulate, so there's many different things that we were just having to do. So we carry ourselves, we're likely to be very, very different people, have different ways of doing things. And but when you go into the corporate world or so, it's almost as if you're having to leave your blackness at the door. Subject, and this varies, the scale of it. Some places might be quite progressive, some places will be horrendous, but everywhere you're having to leave. Everybody has to leave some of what they are at the door when you're going to work, but we're having to leave a lot, if not most of what we are at the door. But even when we leave at the door, people still see that. So we'll still see that for who you are if you're not careful. So well, even if you are careful. So yeah, so in terms of the actual, so what we did, and I'll probably read one or two for you. So in terms of the actual things that were advice for actually assimilating, in Think Like a White Man, we have something called 187 do's and don'ts. And I'll just read quickly 3 for you. Number 1, do cape for whiteness as if your life depends on it. Your career certainly does. Number 5, I'll probably read. Wear cheap branded glasses to interviews, even if you don't need them. It softens your image and indicates a vulnerability as opposed to blackness. Plus, no one who ever wore glasses ever did anything black. I'm going to look for one that's not too offensive. Do keep your ethnic festivals to yourself when in the office. Kwanzaa, the Independence Days of certain African and Caribbean countries, Jay-Z album's album release day, the fall of apartheid. Such celebrations should be held behind closed doors and privately and firmly away from eyes, ears, and fears of white people. So there's just a few of them, but it's all boiled down to the same thing, assimilation. People want to see themselves in you.
I mean, it's so fascinating because at once it's like I'm sat here and I'm smiling about it, but on another hand, it's like the knowledge of the pain of it. You know, I'm sorry that you had to go through the things that you've described, and I'm sorry that all other Black people also have to do that, because in the end, it's not what makes you the person that you are or good at your job or the reason that people hired you, you know, and it just takes away from having that ability to shine when you're always having to watch your back. And I think that's the thing that's why I'm wondering now with the advent of Black Lives Matter and it being much more in people's consciousness, you know, will there be a natural shift? Will there be a natural change? Will we always have to assimilate? Will our children have to assimilate?
I would be surprised if they don't. It breaks my heart to say that, but I think that if there's any change that could actually lead to our children not assimilating or so, it'll probably be, we are a very different generation, Charmaine. So you and I both have children who are similar ages. I think there's about a year or two between both your son and my daughter. And I hope I haven't revealed about too much about our private lives there or so, right? But
no, it's fine.
I think we are the one area that the people who I've seen. I have a 6-year-old daughter, and but you take, for example, the one area that I felt that we were a little bit different, that we probably could have done things a bit differently or so, was probably more in the business realm or so, in which so you take, for example, I look at your career. You've done so many things. You've taken risks. You've owned a bookshop or so. You've gone into publishing, where you've established your own label or so, where you've gone in there almost literally as a boss, coming up with ideas, or doing different ways of doing it, and empowering people or so at the same time. You are clearly one of those people who's making change, who's a living, breathing change maker, who's a living, breathing change maker. So I don't think the likelihood of you having to go into the office or so and having to actually leave a burdensome amount of who you are at the door is probably a lot more limited to, say, somebody who's an investment manager in the City of London. And I think the key area here is the difference is that it's just that element of which we just have to probably take a little bit more risk as far as establishing our own business institutions within the community and everything else or so, and also patronizing them, doing business with them, paying for their services, and building up some degree of infrastructure in which we can actually create opportunities for ourselves, speaking as Black people, for ourselves within the community, so we're not over-reliant on these institutions to the point where we're having to almost throw away everything that makes us unique and special in order to actually get on within those organizations.
I wonder if you wanted to read a little bit more from the book, just for a few minutes. I've got some more questions, but I think it's really helpful for people to kind of get the style and the tone of it, for those who are not coming here as your fans, but are coming because they're really intrigued, who haven't read the book yet. Let's give them a bit of a taster.
I'll give them the white man commandments. So the white man commandments, they're 10 commandments of white men, or so, not of white men, but of white men. And I must be clear, there's a difference between a white man and a white man. A white man, when I speak of the white man commandments, is a white man, as in a man who is racialized as white, but has ruling class credentials and abilities and everything else. And these men, these ruling, powerful men, Tony Blair, Donald Trump, what's the name of the weirdo in France? Emmanuel Macron, so on and so forth. Or so. I won't say why I say he's a weirdo, but he's a weirdo. Yeah. Nicolas Sarkozy, David Cameron, that ilk of white man or so. That white man who will go and bomb your country and literally say that, look, bomb your country to smithereens and tell you to say thank you for the democracy he's given you, which literally, when you're paying a warlord to go and find your way to get water to drink or so, they still want you to believe that some degree of democracy. But anyway, the white man commandments, and there's 10 of them. Power is everything, and winning it justifies anything. 2, politics trumps performance. 3, compassion impedes progress. 4, victory is only complete upon the absolute humiliation, or preferably humiliating death of an opponent. 5, racism has immense strategic benefit. 6, reality is whatever a white man, or at least a white person, says it is. This is otherwise known as the I'm white and I'm right rule. 7, activism is a societal ill, but occasionally a useful tool. 8, sex is a tool, a weapon, and otherwise merely entertainment. 9, a white man must be respected, feared, or in the very least, loved. 10, the white man is God. And this is exemplified by the notion that Jesus is white, Columbus discovered America, William Shakespeare is a better writer or a better storyteller than the great Christopher Wallace, otherwise known as the Notorious B.I.G. Elvis is king, the Beatles are the greatest, etc., so on and so forth. And that's just the white man commandments for you. There's a lot more where that comes from.
Yeah, I love it. It's so true. I mean, it's everything that we experience in living in a Western world, living in Europe, living in America, then it's, whiteness is just so pervasive. And, the way in which, this is with the Black Cultural Archives, and the way in which we even, our history has to be just boiled down to 1 month. And at the BCA, we say, every day is Black History Day. Whilst we're learning about what was happening with the Tudors, as we're always doing at schools in the UK, then we should have also been learning about the Black Tudors, and we should have been learning about what was happening during that time for lots of other different people, whether it be Asian, whether it be Black people in other continents of the world. I mean, it's just, I really hope that the next generations will look back at us and question why we didn't question these things enough earlier. I think there's a lot of things that we allowed to just kind of happen because the subjugation was just so strong, basically. But it feels like there's an advent of different people asking questions. So it's not just coming from Black people, it's also coming from white people now as well, which I think is really important. We spoke a little bit about the Black Writers Guild, and
the funny thing, Charmaine, is that, oh, sorry.
No, go on. Say what you're going to say.
I was going to say that you could be forgiven. Okay, you could be forgiven for believing that that Black people did not exist before the 1500s, before slavery began. That if the British curriculum education system was left to its vices or so, without great campaigners and also and historians and everybody else, so really bringing things to the forefront or so, you could be forgiven. And many people still walk around with this foolery to this very day. that that Black history stopped with, well, certainly started with slavery, also with the European interaction or exploitation of Africans. Because there's so much happened before that, there's so much happened during that time, there's so much happened after that time or so, and these are things that and it's all part of our national story. And I think that it's really important that we find a way to make sure this story is told, or else we're not really telling the story, or so we're just telling essentially some sweet lies about who or what we are.
Yeah, that's why I think listening to podcasts such as 1619 is really important. And before, when lockdown started and we were homeschooling, then I didn't follow my son's curriculum. I started teaching him about the Benin Empire, for example. And every day we looked at a different country in Africa. We were learning about that. And it was really interesting because suddenly it became a thing around the murder of George Floyd and Black Lives Matter, but actually I was doing it anyway because I just saw it as an opportunity to connect him to the work that he wouldn't be able to do otherwise. And I feel like we've all benefited from understanding African and Caribbean nations during this period. It's something that we'll continue to do, but that's again part of the work that I think once you get to 8 years old, you start doing as conscious Black people anyway, to hand on to the next generation, because that is how the word is passed. And so what I'm thinking of how the word is passed, I think it's so important that we inspire other people, other Black people in how to have a career as a writer. So I'd love to spend the last moments talking about that, because your book is so original. That's what, just from the second you open it, you're just like, I've not dealt with anything on this level. It's just amazing. It's super inspiring. So I would love for you to inspire our potential writers out there who are listening to this conversation. And can you share with us your journey into writing? And becoming a published author.
It's a very good question. My journey into writing. Okay, so my journey into writing probably started when I was about. So I had a very unique childhood. I was born into foster care, then moved back to London to go live with my mum. Then my mum sent me to go live in Nigeria for a bit of time. And it was when I was in Nigeria so that I think I really became a writer, because literature was a very, very big subject for us as children. And so you had to read what was more the Nigerian classics, or so, as well as the British classics. So, of course, Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe was probably the crowning jewel in which you had to read. So for me, after that, I joined my school's press club. And then I went on to lead my school's press club. Came back to Britain, went to university, became a writer when I was at university. Used to write for hip hop magazines. For a long time, I did that. Then I graduated, became a banker. But at the same time, I was writing for publications such as The Voice, The Standard, anywhere I could potentially write. But the key thing here is that how did I get to this very moment right here, right now? I started writing. I realized after a bit of time, I wrote certain articles that connected quite well. And I had some experiences in the corporate world. I just felt that it was time for me to actually really write something substantive and really just show to the world what I'm potentially capable of. So I like every writer does, I had my ideas. I picked what I thought was the best one for at that very moment. And I just started to literally just write it. Like the thing about writing is that no one's going to really urge you to do it. You just have to want to do it yourself. You just have to start writing and rewriting and getting things wrong and then getting things right. So I did all that. And then I finished writing Think Like a White Man, first draft. And I sent it out to every agent in Britain that I could. No one, of course, no. It's a satirical, black as hell satirical book written by a fictional satirical professor of white people studies. This was 2015 or so. No one was going to get that. No one got it, and no agent got it whatsoever. So it's a 99.9% white industry. No agent got it. They all turned it down. Penguin Random House put together a program called Write Now, which was a competition, and you had to send in the first 1,000 words of your book in order to, just the first 1,000 words of your book, just send it into them, and then it was a competition to find new writers and new voices. And I sent in the first 1,000 words of my book. I nearly forgot to do so because I was in bed in Barcelona, and I just quickly jumped up and quickly just sent it into them. And to my absolute shock, and I mean real shock, they picked the book. They picked this crazy black satire out of over 2,000 books. They thought this was something worth taking forward. So I was shortlisted. I was longlisted. So out of 2,000 people, I was in the top 150. Then I was in the top 260. Then I made it to the top 12. And till this very day, I can't lie to you, I'm a bit shocked. And then, so I was working with this amazing young editor, like I think she's about 15 and a half. She's not. She's I think she's in her 20s or 30s now. But this very young editor at Penguin called Lydia Yaddy. And Lydia was so brilliant to show me how publishing works and demystifying it to me and everything else. And I repaid her by betraying her by selling the book to Canongate or so. And so that's a lesson in being a writer or so, that eventually you are going to betray your friends. And and then Canongate picked her up. And Canongate has this crazy, brilliant editor called Hannah Knowles who really liked the book. But there's also got this crazy owner who's this brilliant man called Jamie Bing. And Hannah and Jamie, we all met up, we did lunch, and they showed me how much they liked it, loved it. So they managed to persuade me. So it took a white man to poach me away from the good people at Penguin. And here we are right now. But if I was to give any advice for any new writer, is this: just write and read. You're going to get things wrong. You're going to make a fool of yourself. But keep writing when you've made a fool of yourself. Just keep going, and read more stuff. Read Think Like a White Man. I guarantee you it will help you. Or read other books also out there. The book that really inspired me to make me a writer is a book that I read when I was about 19 years old. And there's a book called The Coldest Winter Ever by a lady called Sister Soldier. Yeah. Oh, the book that, yeah.
What was her name, sorry?
The Coldest Winter Ever by Sister Soldier. This book made me a writer. Made me a professional. Sister Soldier. You must have read this, Charmaine.
I haven't read it.
So yeah, it's a book called The Coldest Winter Ever by Sister Soldier. It's a brilliant book. Really? Yeah, I'm going to send it to you. I would say it's a brilliant book. It's almost like it was YA before YA. Yeah. Who inspired? So Sister Soldier definitely inspired me. I would certainly say. I was definitely inspired by one of my uncles, a guy called. Go ahead.
No, I was saying carry on. Who inspires you?
Go ahead, Charmaine.
Keep going.
I was certainly inspired by in terms of actual writers or so. There's quite Sister Soldier is the one that really inspired me. I loved Barack Obama's prose. I thought Barack Obama, ironically, was a fantastic writer. Carter G. Woodson, I thought, was a brilliant writer or so too. Of course, Chinua Achebe is the originality of his thought process or so. I loved how he actually put words together or so. I loved how he was able to put words together. But I would really say of any book that has inspired me or so, it's Sister Soldier's Coldest Winter Ever, because it was so original. It made me I did not know you could write like that prior to me reading Sister Soldier's book. And it's then I realized, okay, that writing doesn't have to be one way. It could be very different ways, in unique ways too. So I really would say Sister Soldier is why I'm sat here as a writer today.
You were going to say something about your uncle.
Yeah. Yeah, one of my uncles, I don't really give him enough credit or so. My uncle was a Nigerian journalist my uncle was a guy called Andrew Clough. He lived actually a bit of a tragic life, unfortunately, because the collapse of Nigerian society meant that his career and everything else collapsed. But he was this guy who was such a great journalist and great storyteller that he really just piqued my interest in telling stories. And because he would stay up at night and tell us about coup plots and how these brave young military men or so would plot coups under the threat of potential execution if they were caught. And he would tell us these stories about them. And I found him to be such a brilliant writer and a brilliant speaker or so. And he died, unfortunately, quite poor. forbid the thought that happens to me. But yeah, but he was somebody who really inspired me as a storyteller, more so than a storyteller than the writer itself. But he was a brilliant guy. Rest in peace, Uncle Andrew.
So as you can see that the it's getting dark in my room as we get into a Berlin evening. We're an hour ahead of you in the UK. And so the final thing that I want to say to you before we descend into darkness and we finish up, what's been a really illuminating discussion. Thank you so much, Nels. I've really, really loved this book. And it's been really great to talk to you and big up for all the work that you do, amplifying Black people and Black writers in this country. Thank you so much. So the final question that I have for you is, how can we get your book to every CEO and hiring manager in the
UK? We need to speak to Canongate, and we'll sit down, we'll find a way to make sure they just send it out to everyone so they can get it. Every CEO, every head of HR, although heads of HR probably won't like reading the book that much because it doesn't really speak too well of them. But yeah, every CEO needs to certainly read this or so, and then read it again, and then resign and put a Black person in their place. There we go. And off we go from there. But yeah.
Thank you so much, Nels. Do you want to hold up a copy of Think Like a White Man? Because I don't have mine with me.
Think Like a White Man. Oh dear, you can't see it much. There we go. Think Like a White Man. The brutally original satire. But there we go.
Brutally original. Thank you, Charmaine. Satire. Thank you so much, Nels, and congratulations on everything so far. And I hope that it flies. It's available in all good bookshops. It's available online. Get your copy, get reading, and join in the satire. But also remember that there's a very serious note behind this book, and as it aspires towards equality rather than assimilation. So thank you so much. And thank you to everyone for joining us this evening and buy the book.
Thank you, Charmaine. Bless you. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.